Probably the first thing is you're constantly learning because it is still so new. Anytime you hit a new, different platform, the more times you work on it, the more you figure things out. So Mozart's 10 episodes, so it's only 20 episodes, but across 20 episodes, you will change the way you approach. Like after season 1 of HDR, because it's a trim pass on top of your SDR color grade, so when I finished that, I changed the way I graded the SDR for season 2 of Mozart, knowing where I was heading for the HDR afterwards, so that I could end up with an easier time or a better place. And after doing season 2 of HDR, I'm actually going to change the way I grade for season 3, again, because of finding different avenues, different things to do, that I can take advantages of the HDR world in a different way without having to go back and rebuild grades from scratch. Because the idea is to make it a trim pass, not a completely new color correction, even if it is a different platform.
So when you say you changed the way that you did the SDR and the HDR grade, does that mean your SDR result was different?
No, my SDR picture is exactly the same. I have the same endpoint, but I build the grade difference. So instead of building so much of the grade and at the beginning of the color corrector, where it's hard to go back and get in front of it to change things, to take advantage of highlights, lowlights, contrast, I built a portion of the color at the back end of the color corrector instead. So I could go in and those 4 channels of secondary, when I went into HDR, I turned those 4 off. I turned on 4 new ones for HDR and built a trim into there and was able to apply that to the whole episode and have it take it from here and tweak it over to here without having to go into each shot on a grade. Then I can go through the whole episode and go shot by shot and just look for things that I need to fix. Windows appear differently because they're getting 10 times the contrast ratio, so it will affect what you did in those. So some windows that were invisible in SDR are now visible in HDR, so you have to go through and adjust those accordingly.
So you started to touch on some of the things that HDR allows you to do by talking about a hot window, right, where you can bring out different detail that you weren't able to get to in SDR. Can you talk a little bit about how you would use that, how you would not use that? Do you use it all the time?
Well,
what do you do in those situations?
The basic principle of doing and of course this is all just my personal opinion because color is totally subjective, as we all know, so everybody has their own avenue of doing it. But for me, the point of doing an HDR version is so that when someone looks at the SDR and then they look at the HDR, they go, wow. If there's no wow factor, it's like, what's the point of seeing the other version? So at the very least, your basic picture has an additional pop to it, extra life, a little extra depth. But like in season 1 of Mozart in the Jungle, they shot in New York, and they had this beautiful restaurant scene with all glass windows with the bridge outside. And you could almost not see the bridge because it was rated so hot in the exposures that in SDR we couldn't save the bridge. But when I got into the HDR, I was able to go back and rebuild all the keying and the windows, and you could see the entire bridge, so the entire scene. So that's a place where we were able to take advantage of it and gain a lot of depth and feel for the scene. Other scenes, where you may not want to see that, we burned the windows on purpose because we're not supposed to be where we are. So it's literally very selective of where you choose to take advantage of the additional highlights, where you don't take highlights. Beach scenes where you have burned out clouds that would have looked really nice, you didn't have in the SDR, you're able to go back and build some windows and track those in and bring that back into play.
So you talked a little bit about the depth that HDR now gives, right? And I can say, as you guys saw those images, you probably saw there's a lot more depth, right? You're feeling like you can see through, like you're looking through a window and you can see through it there. Why is that important? Why is that not important? What challenges come with that? What benefits come with that?
There's really not a challenge to the additional depth. It's totally an added experience because perfect example would be you're either in a concert hall and you're from the back. It actually feels more like being in a concert hall, or you're outside on a long New York street. It actually will feel more three-dimensional without actually being three-dimensional. Whereas the SDR feels like a regular picture. It doesn't look different. You'll come from a tight scene where someone's in an alley and swing out, and it's like, wow, I feel like I'm seeing the whole street. It's not just the fact that you're actually able to see the detail in the buildings that were burned out, but it actually creates an illusion of 3D, which, depending on your project, is going to be different. If you're in a small, drama where you're just talking back and forth, talking heads the whole time, you're not going to have as much of an advantage for that. But take like The Martian or any other space movie, that's going to really, really help you feel, different. It's going to make you feel like you're out there much more. Sort of like, I only go see movies in 3D that are going to really take advantage of it, not just for the 3D thing. I'll definitely go see any space movie because I want to feel that difference. So a movie like that is really going to be able to take advantage of it because it already has it, and then it'll accentuate it even more, and make you feel, like I said, a different experience. And it's not the same thing. So it all depends on the content, where you take advantage of that more, where you feel the advantage.
In your first statement, you said that you start with the SDR first, and then you move to the HDR. Some colorists may prefer to start with the HDR, move to the SDR. Some creatives might prefer to move from the HDR to the SDR. Is there a particular reason that you choose to start with the SDR and move to HDR, or?
Well, I don't know of many people who are choosing, many colorists who are choosing to start with the HDR before the SDR. There are a lot of people who are not in the chair who are saying, why wouldn't you start with the highest quality version first and then do the lower quality version like we do all this other mastering work? Well, the big difference is they are different. They are not the same. It is not just we went from standard def to HD or from HD to 4K UHD. So it's just a better looking version of the same image. It is very different. Your eye interprets it different. You can't make the same color decisions. If I color the SDR first and then I put that up as my reference, CTM, and I'm doing my HDR pass. Pretty soon you're looking at your CTM and going, this looks awful, it looks like mush, but in your head you're like, I know this is correct, I know this is right, I have to honor this look that the creatives have had me make and do the best I can to take advantage of HDR but have it feel here. If you try to do the reverse, what your brain does is it makes you create an overly contrasty, overly saturated SDR version because your brain can't turn off that other image. It's sort of like when you see those illusions where you're looking at a white card with a green shape and you take away the green shape and you see the same shape red. You can't say to your brain, don't do that. It just does it. And it's the same way with going from HDR to SDR. It just does not allow you to make the same decisions as you would. And I would lay money if you had somebody time something in SDR and then took it away and then single stimulus had them do it in HDR and then do the reverse. They will not come out with the same SDR version. They will come out with in my opinion, a worse SDR version because it will be based on them looking at the HDR to SDR.
Any questions so far before we continue? Oh, got one in the back.
Bridge example. Why can't you make an SDR and see the bridge too?
Because it was rated up so high, you can only bring the clips down so far before the video folds down on itself and keep the mids up. To see the bridge, I could have, but I would have had to bring the whole picture down so that I could bring down because you only have so far that you can bend, and then all of a sudden it all starts bending over, folding over on itself, the video signal.
Make a window?
That's with windowing and everything. The only way you could do it, which is not really cost effective, is if you paid to have somebody roto and build you mats for the interior because the transition is too small to hide for traditional windows how different that color correction has to be.
So this show was shot raw?
Yes. And that's one of the things I've been warning DPs this pilot season. I'm like, don't get a false sense of security in your highlights and what you're going to see when you get into timing. Because everybody is going through LUTs for all their dailies, which are using film curves, which are rolling them over in a different way than color correctors can roll them over. It can roll them over in a way that softer and further down than a color corrector can before it starts folding over on itself.
Okay, so you mentioned film curves. How does what you're doing now with video compare to what people did with film? Was film at a higher dynamic range than what we have when people were projecting celluloid prints in motion picture theaters just a few years ago? Did that have as high, or did it have a higher dynamic range than what you're trying to do with HDR?
So you and I talked a little bit about it during the break, but just for everyone's benefit, of course there's a difference between the theatrical projection and the home projection. The theatrical projection with laser primaries can get it really dark and can include benefit of local contrast. It's hard to answer what's the specific difference in contrast ratio from what you could get from a certain print stock, but what I can tell you is because you have laser primaries within projection, they're able to turn off certain sections of the image to give you pixels next to each other that are of different luminance values. With film, with a single bulb behind the film, it had to obstruct light still. So if it didn't fully obstruct light, you would get a lifted black level out of it still.
Yeah, they call it the D-max. But when you were making imposition prints, those blacks were incredibly black.
And so
It's more important to make the black black than to make the picture brighter.
I would agree with you as well. So in addition to the theatrical, we have the home. In the home screen, we have two different types that are primarily in the market, LCD and OLED. The differences in these technologies are actually great for what they can present to HDR and why the UHD Alliance has two different specifications. The LCD uses a local backlight dimming technology, which is panel-based, not pixel-based, which means a certain panel is going to have to dim down or up depending on what all of the luminance within that square is supposed to be. Again, what you're going to end up doing is lifting the black level at a certain point because it has to push higher brightness. If you use OLED, each pixel next to each other is illuminated differently. So similar to laser primaries in the theater, an OLED can give you a better local contrast and make a black pixel. This is why, for one of the reasons that we prefer using the X300, because it gives us that local black on every pixel, or that local luminance on every pixel, not based on a panel on the back.
The problem is you can't control the ambient light in somebody's living room.
100% correct, and we've never been able to do that. So when we graded 100 nits, one of the reasons these TVs have pushed to 300 or 400 is because they know somebody's watching it in a bright room, and we graded in a dark room. So that's the purpose of that, is really to balance out somebody's watching it with all their lights on. Similarly here, we just need a target. We need to know what we're grading to, and then if somebody watches it in the right environment, we know that it'll be right, or at least as close to right as that television can represent. We can never control the living room. Reality is there's technology out there like the Philips Hue bulb, where you could control the living room with your movie, but I don't know, 1 in a million homes might have that. So it's not something that's yet scalable to a point where you can actually control the environment that somebody's going to watch it in. And it also doesn't say that the consumer is actually going to want to watch it in a dim environment. Yes, sir.
Two questions. One, by doing the two masters, is this effectively doubling the cost of the color correction for a producer?
Well, that's why we're trying to make it a trim pass, so it's not double. First season of Mozart was a complete regrade. It was a complete, start over and build the exact same thing as the first season. Season 2 was not. It was a trim pass on top of my live grade, which is why it's so important to build your grade so that it can be used as a starting point, because you don't have to rebuild all that windowing, you don't have to redo all that tracking, you don't have to build all that. You're supposed to be able to take it and just take your color space and take it from 709 to P3 as a starting point. And then the difference, the main difference is adjusting contrast, because when you throw it right up on an HDR monitor, it's way too hot. You've got to rein it in, and then after you build that default rein in, then it's going in and seeing what didn't work, which windows. I've mostly seen, if you have a window, the darker you've made it, it's going to double it up. It's going to 10 times that. So it's going to be even darker and even more saturated on the HDR. So you'll have to open it up and desaturate it. And then conversely, any windows where you've lifted it to dig some daylight, you'll end up with this floating ghosty shape, and you have to go in and fine tune that. Anything in the middle third seems to hold pretty well. So if you have a show that does almost no windowing and you color grade it a certain way, you're going to have a really quick trim pass, because you're going to be able to just take a whole scene. I've had some where I've done a whole scene where I had no windows in it, and it was a single correction across the whole thing, going from SDR to HDR. Just that one offset of take off these 4, put on these 4, and I was there. So that's the whole reason of trying to in my mind, change my grading so that I still get my SDR exactly where I want it, and I can get to my HDR very, very quickly.
Okay, I guess the second part of it is, how do you reconcile the fact I have a friend that just watched Mozart in the Jungle, all of it on their laptop?
Well, I buy a little bit of all the different devices just so I can see how different they look. Before streaming started and we had just some DVDs coming out, people could go buy the DVD. My theory was I color grade for the DVD, because it's the only one that actually, when they bring it home and put it in, that's going to be the accurate representation on somebody who has a decent television set. Because it's almost impossible to chase everything. Laptops, the biggest problem is it's contrasty, it's washed out. It's really not so much the color, the hue, it's what are they doing contrast-wise. So for me, what I try to do on my shows is make sure I'm not leaving anything in the lowlights that if they open it up, they're going to go, God, look at all that. Because, or if like you're doing a murder show and you don't want to see the killer, you got to make sure, and this actually comes from my time I spent in DI, where you would build windows for timing for the theater, and you go in and do the home deliverables, and it all falls apart. So basically you started to grade with the intention of, okay, it's got to look good here and there. So it's the same kind of thing. You got to think ahead of time, okay, how is this going to look there on this? You're not going to gain detail back in your highlights if somebody's doing this with their monitor or any other device, but you will gain low light detail if you go home and you have an LCD and you sit off skew of it and you watch a lot of TV. You can see people's windows floating around the screen if they don't blend them well enough. If I sit on this side of the big L couch in my living room, I can sit there and watch all kinds of windows on television shows if I'm off skew from it. And that literally doesn't have to be that way. You can still have it hidden. It's just once you see down into the bottom, you've got to take the time to blur it out and make sure it doesn't work. So that's all you can really do. You can't guarantee they're going to see the right contrast, but you can still guarantee the experience is going to be nice.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You talked about the difference between SD and UHD and bright scenes. What about a dark scene?
Dark scene HDR versus SDR?
Yes.
For me so far, I know you have the ability to dig more out in the lowlights for HDR, but most shows they only want to see what they want to see in the lowlights. Most shows are not looking to dig stuff out in the lowlights. So I'm always sitting my lowlights right on the same place. The only difference is how quickly it transitions from that darkest up. So for me, it's just I can make it feel really close to the same darkness of the scene. The only difference is like it'll be crisper is the best way I can put it, because the highlights will be a little poppier, but all the feel of the scene will still be as dark.
Any other questions? All right, well, I'll ask one. Is there any different skill set, tool set that you would have to use? Is there any limitation, benefit that you get from these different screens? What's different about your actual work, your hands-on work?
Well, that's two parts. There's my personal preference is to not work in a workflow that doesn't let you still have your raw as you're grading HDR after SDR. I still want to have my raw with my live grade with my full color correction tools. Some of the workflows out there don't do that. They take what you have and they give it to you embedded, and then they give you a limited tool set. Disadvantage, obviously, is because you get to a scene, you're like, oh, I want to do this. You can't. You're stuck. It's like It's like if someone gives you an already LUTed image and it goes color cracked, or take it back to when we would transfer film dailies for television, and you'd get in to do your color timing, and you'd be like, the dailies colorist, handcuff me. We have to retransfer this flatter. It's the same kind of thing. Why would you do that when you can have the raw? The other part is the monitor side of it, and that is really knowing what the creatives on the show wanted. And that to me is the number one thing, is honoring the intent of the mood, the feel, and the interpretation that everyone wanted for the show. So it may be a wowier, poppier, version of the show, but the one thing every DP has told me, because I've had multiple DPs on Mozart, and I've done some other small things, they're like, honor the photography. No matter what, I don't care how poppy it is or what you do as far as making it HDR-ish, just honor the photography so it still feels the same. So it can feel different, it can look different, but it can feel the same. Sort of like you were saying about the dark scene, it's still got to feel dark. But instead of just because I can dig out the low light doesn't mean I should dig out the low light. So it's the tools are there if someone really wants to do it. Like someone may, like I've had some shows where like, it just doesn't feel surreal and overcranked enough because no one will let me do this for SDR. No one will let me take it that far. And then I can see them going to HDR and going, now I can. Now I can really make this, a crazy, drug-induced experience or something like they were really, wanting to do. So that's a place where you would really take advantage of the tools and have different experiences, a different, totally different version to be like, or you could see a creative going, I did what I could with the SDR, but you got to see the HDR to see my intention. Sort of like a director going, my director's cut is what I intended. I know this is what they released.
And do you have, are there any limitations that you run into in either how the content is shot or how the screen is set up? And any limitations in what you would want to be able to do that you can't?
So far, everyone is shooting it like they always have, as if they're shooting film still, most of the time. Going for my best exposure, I want my faces at the right levels, I want my detail at the right levels, I want to burn this out, I don't want to burn this out. So I haven't had somebody going, I'm going to expose this way because I know in HDR I can do this. I'm not worried about having that detail here because I'll get it in HDR. Everyone wants the best image in SDR, so no one has modified that yet. They've only maybe accentuated things in HDR. So far, no.
Okay. And then I know that you graded, for instance, on the X300 for the Mozart and Amazon work. Is there do you feel limited in any way by that screen?
By the X300?
Yeah.
No, it's actually really color accurate. The biggest difference is working on the plasma versus the OLED is you've got a different black quality. And the best way I can describe it is how and this is really funny to think about a plasma that has these rich blacks being the one that actually has the blacks you can see into. Sort of like how when you're in the theater you can see into the blacks even when it's a dark scene and you're watching a film, and you watch it on your TV and it is jet black. It's the same kind of thing when you're looking at your plasma versus your OLED X300, and this is all the OLED technology for that matter, where it is making these blacks that are just super black. And that's great for a show that you take your blacks and you sit them right down the bottom and you want blacks, and you can just make the same blacks on the other one. But when you have a show like a bunch of season 1 on Mozart, it was a lifted black. It was supposed to feel filmic. It was supposed to be able to see into the blacks. Honoring lifted blacks and floated blacks on an OLED, and even more so in HDR, is more challenging because it's trying to crunch it down automatically just by the technology. So you have to play a little bit more with the blacks. So that's really the only difference. Otherwise, it's really color accurate.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Are you finding any specifics or limitations on the camera capture devices between all the manufacturers?
I'd say the biggest thing is I still see more, and this is an SDR as well, I see more noise in the low end of the Sony, the F55, X65 in SDR. Well, as we try to hide it in there, you have to try to hide it even more on the HDR because you're seeing into the blacks more. So you really have to make sure you're keeping your blacks down, or otherwise you'll end up with incredibly noisy blacks outside of that, and everything seems to be, carrying across as it is.
Alexa versus red or?
No, they're all, everybody is, I've been able to come up with all images I'm happy with, and I'm not disappointed with more than I am in the current world.
Any other questions? Okay. Anything else you want to add for final thoughts or comments on?
Have you graded for Dolby Vision yet?
I have not graded on it yet, no. I'm actually, I was supposed to yesterday, but I didn't get to. I would have had a little bit more information for you had I. I know that part of what they want to do is do them side by side, is what I've heard, and you have a limited tool set for when you do the SDR. So my brain is not looking forward to seeing both at the same time and trying to make both decisions at the same time. But I'm open to go in and see what it's about and see what I come up with. My ask is going to be, after we do this, can I please just grade the SDR on its own and see what I come up with, to be able to show, is this really the best? Whether they'll get to do that, I don't know. It's it's just like one color corrector versus another. You don't know until you actually play on, for sure.
And so Technicolor does have colorists who have worked on Dolby Vision, both theatrical and the Pulsar grade. And yeah, each colorist, they're artists, they have their own experience, they have their own feedback. But Technicolor, back to our open approach, we do make every piece of content, right? So if it's a Dolby Vision grade that the customer wants, we'll make that. If it's an open standard version that the customer wants, we'll make that. It's not that we push one over the other. Any other questions? Okay, final thoughts?
I would say see as many different images as you can on the difference. Like if you can see a bunch of different demos of SDR versus HDR, see as many different images as you can, because every different show it's a different interpretation. It's a different, there's different advantages, taking advantage. Some come in with a mandate of, I want you to clip and crush everything exactly like I did on SDR, so that's going to be a different experience in HDR versus someone who tries to take advantage of it. So I wouldn't make a judgment on HDR based on only seeing a couple of images. That's really the main thing.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Sure, of course.
Let's all thank Tim.